very, very strange, something very, very real that is happening on the planet. David Paulides, of course, is the researcher, author, and investigator. He started all this with his book, Missing 411, which dealt with people disappearing in our public park systems. They merely vanished. David, welcome. I'm glad you're still here.
Thanks, George. It's great to be here.
What was it about this subject that got you first involved in investigating it?
Years ago, I was doing some peripheral research in a national park. Noticed a couple of park rangers following me around, which isn't that unusual.
Yeah.
And went back to my location off the park site, and these guys showed up independently. And they said they knew of me, and they had been looking into missing people at the various parks that they had worked at.
Okay.
And they realized that on the front end, when somebody goes missing, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of investigation. And then after about 7 or 8 days, everything stops. And when they tried to find out what happened to the victim and get more information, they were stymied, and they said something didn't feel right.
Yeah.
And then subsequent to the disappearance, the follow-up investigation by special agents of the Park Service really never happened.
Weird.
Very strange. And they said, you know, somebody ought to be looking into this, because the people were disappearing in areas that they didn't think that would fit that normal mode, meaning that you and I say take our kids to the park and a child disappears in a valley area where there's a lot of activity. And we're not talking far back into the backcountry. A lot of these occur right in a populated area of the national park.
In front of other people.
Apparently. And
Jeez.
as we can logically assume, when people go into the backcountry, things happen, and those disappearances occur as well. But it's those valley disappearances that got my interest right away. And of course, your mind may go immediately to, well, it's some kind of person-to-person involvement,
Right,
maybe a
some
human
sicko out there or something.
Right. But when you get into the numbers and you start to vet the cases, you realize that something more is going on than what's readily apparent.
David, of the missing people, and we'll get into a lot of cases tonight, how many never show up where they don't, for example, find the bodies? They're just gone. What's that percent?
It's probably close to 50, maybe 60%.
Just never show up.
Massive searches, hundreds of people, air, ground, dogs, and they can't find the people. When I first started this, I filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests against the National Park Service, asking them for their lists of missing people. And George, if you and I walked into any medium-sized police department in the United States and asked the chief for a list of missing people in his jurisdiction or her jurisdiction,
We'd get it. We'd get it.
Within an hour.
Yeah.
He'd have it, or she'd have it on her desk. National Park Service says they don't keep track of that information.
They don't keep track of people disappearing in their parks.
That's what they
That's
say.
bizarre.
I would agree.
I would think that there's some clandestine operation tracking all this right now, and they're perplexed.
Well, I've talked to some of the best investigative journalists in the United States, and they said they're outright lying to you.
Yes.
They have a list of missing people.
They've got to. In your opinion, David, how many people are missing just from the park systems alone?
Well, that's tough because they won't tell us.
And we don't know how far back to go, right? 1700s, 1800s?
Well, just in our research, I have cases going back. There's 9 countries that we've documented these incidents in that fit this profile.
Same profile.
And in those 9 countries, we have one case that goes all the way back to 1768 in France.
Huh. If you had to guess, though, speculate on how many total people we're talking about disappearing.
So we've documented right now in our books about 1,100.
1,100 people
Right.
since this first episode to where we are today. And they continue. This bizarre case, now this guy was found, but the Toronto firefighter who went skiing in New York disappeared for God knows how long and ended up in California, 2,500 miles away, still in his ski outfit, and has no idea how he got there. Something happened to this guy.
So he's out skiing in the area of Lake Placid with his friends from Toronto. He's a captain in the Toronto Fire Department.
Yeah, he's not fooling around here.
Well, and I don't think people understand that when you become a policeman or a fireman, you go through psychological testing.
Absolutely.
So the person, especially being a captain, the thought of him being mentally unstable, I don't think so.
No.
And
Or playing a game on his family? No.
I don't think so. So the real interesting part of that story is that I've written about people who were skiing who disappeared on the slopes. Some were never found. Some were found later, months and months later, under really unusual conditions. So I think there's a lot of questions. I know he was interviewed by the New York State Police, and they haven't released anything really about that interview. And I know he's back in Canada now. I would love to talk to him, and I'd love to regress his hypnosis.
Oh my God. I mean, did he get picked up by a trucker who was kind enough to take him somewhere? But I mean, what do you tell the trucker? Hi, I'm in my ski outfit. I need to go to California. And does he have money on him? Does he eat? It's weird.
Well, one of the interesting parts of these 1,100 cases, many of them where the victim is found, they have head injuries that have caused death.
Right.
And in his incident, he told the press that he thought he had some type of head injury.
Yes.
So, like you said, they find him with his ski helmet and same clothing. And then the real odd thing to me is he said somewhere along the line he had a haircut.
Yeah. Yeah. Where'd that come from?
Yeah, exactly.
Strange. I remember you told me once on Coast to Coast, the radio show, that in some cases when these people are disappeared, it could be weeks, could be months, and that in some cases they're found and the clothes are clean. No mud, no nothing. If you're in the wilderness for a couple weeks, a couple months, you're going to be dirty and you're going to have dirt everywhere. How could it be so pristine? It's like somebody washed their clothes.
So I'm betting that there's even more to this. It's evident when a searcher finds you if your clothes are really clean. But they never mention the body itself. One of the things I write about in the books is a lot of times if the person's found alive and they get to a hospital, the notes in the hospital is that there's a small fever associated with that person.
Fever, something. Bruises.
No, very
something.
rare bruises.
Yeah.
But a small fever is evident. They never say, and many times you don't get to see the medical report, I would like to know if the body was clean as well.
Like the clothes.
Like the clothes. So if the clothes are clean and the body's clean, you really have something odd going on.
Right.
And
well, it's still odd if the clothes is clean and the body isn't clean. I mean, because
I agree.
I mean, the clothes has got to get dirty before the body, I would think.
You would think so. This case is in my latest book because it is extremely different than a standard disappearance. Carl Dish worked right down the road.
From here?
From here, at Boulder Labs in Colorado.
Wow.
He grew up in Wisconsin, was a star football player, super intellect.
Athletic.
Very. And he became a physicist, which is one of the key points in my books. I have documented several cases of physicists who had disappeared.
And his ancestry, does that?
German.
All right.
Which is another key point. Many German physicists have disappeared.
Really?
And I'm not talking about, they voluntarily, no, they all fit this scenario we're going to talk about. So Dish gets hired. In February, he gets sent to the Bird Ice Station. And he brings his dog with him. And he's an ionospheric physicist. And he works at a lab set up from the main station about 7,000 feet away. And on May 8th, 1965, he's working at this station. Mm-hmm. There's a blizzard going on, big one. And between the two locations, they have a rope that's strung. So as you're walking, even in a blizzard,
you're holding on, you know how to get to the other side.
You're not going to get lost.
Yeah.
So he leaves in the morning hours, and they wait and wait and wait. And after an hour and a half, two guys go out and they look for him. Can't find him. So they call everybody together, and they get in their big winter suits, and they get out their tractors and their snow buggies, and they're looking for him.
Yeah, I'd say the guy had a heart attack. He's in the snow somewhere, right?
Of course, yeah. And he's made this trip hundreds of times. It's not like he's going to get lost.
Right.
So they search for him for a week. They find nothing. And he had called his parents in the weeks before. He said everything was great, no problem. He's learning a lot. He's enjoying this experience. So during that week period of time, They called for more assistance from other people at other nearby stations. They find nothing. And they brought in dogs, and they thought even his own dog, if they brought it out, would find him.
Sure.
Right. Nothing. Now, since the time Dish disappeared, there's been less and less ice at the ice station in that area. His body's never been found. Now, when we did the research on this, one of the unusual things in one of the articles in one of the newspapers is that people at the ice station had reported in the days while they were searching a humming sound and strange lights in the sky.
Oh boy.
And I wrote about this.
Yeah.
Well, then the head of the Bird Ice Station came out and said, hey, that's a lie. This has never happened. The people aren't telling the truth. And I thought it was strange how hard they came out to deny that aspect.
Yeah.
Now, Dish was never found.
To this day, never found?
None of his equipment's been found. None of his boots. A very strange disappearance.
And how far in that region, in a blizzard, would somebody go? Not far.
I don't think you could go far.
No. That's what's even stranger.
Well, and then in the stories I write, many times somebody disappears with their dog. And sometimes the dog comes back and sometimes it doesn't. In this incident, weeks after Dish disappeared, his dog disappeared and was never found. I think that's odd.
I'm not sure I would want to take my family through a national park after talking to you and reading Missing 411.
You know, George, one of the things I do when I talk to groups is I tell them I'm a big advocate of the national park system. I go all the time. But there's a couple things I won't do. I won't go alone. I always carry a personal transponder. And if you're taking kids, keep your kids in front of you and always keep them in sight.
Eloise Lindsay Page.
That is one of the more unusual stories along the Appalachian Trail in South Carolina. She was in Table Rock State Park. And I've written a lot about the Appalachian Trail. There's a lot of really unusual things that have happened there and a lot of strange disappearances all along there. She was an older lady, I think she was in her early 20s, going to do a hike of 43 miles. And she was well prepared, lots of experience. She was going to get picked up, I think, 7 to 8 days after her drop-off point. Well, she wasn't there for the pickup point. Her story is that about 3 days into it, there were a series of men that were following her and harassing her on the trail. Now, when you just take it at that point, hey, maybe it's happened.
Maybe.
This went on for days. And eventually, 14, 18 days, a hunter finds her cowering in the woods.
Cowering. She's alive.
Alive. They bring her out, and she tells this story that these men followed her, harassed her. She dumped her backpack. She got rid of everything. And then she was eventually went to the hospital. The interesting part of the story to me isn't what she said, because she never explained exactly what she saw. But when her mom was interviewed, her mom said, I'm not sure what really happened to my daughter in the woods, and I don't really know for sure what my daughter saw in the woods.
Huh. Like she was not accepting the story of the men?
Or her daughter obviously wasn't comfortable in telling the whole story. But that scenario of the men along the Appalachian Trail, there's been many disappearances there over the years where people are just never found. There's a woman named Geraldine Largay that was in Maine that was walking the entire Appalachian Trail, and every day or every 2 days her husband would resupply her. She was 66 years old, I think, maybe a little older. Phenomenal shape.
Jeez.
She'd call her husband all the time. One day didn't call. Massive search. Maine Warden Service threw everything at that search, and even the wardens said they couldn't believe they didn't find anything of her. Still never been found. That was a real troubling one. But every once in a while, something very, very bizarre and strange happens, and these people disappear and aren't found. And I'm not talking just on very rural trails. I'm talking about on some of the main trails inside the park. There's a man named George Penka disappeared on one of the biggest trails in Yosemite 2 years ago. And I know some of the people that were involved with that, and they said, there's no way that guy could have disappeared. He was a robust man, not in terrific shape. He wasn't going to go anywhere off the trail. He vanished, and to this day, they've never found him.
But you would think that you would hear screams, yells, help me. None of that.
No. Every once in a while, there'll be a small shriek, but again, a lot of times it can't be attributed directly to the victim. It's just something that happens in conjunction with the disappearance. And sometimes it's not even in that exact area that they believed that their son or daughter was in. So I'm not even sure if it's related, but they report it sometimes.
Does this story scare you? I mean, you've been uncovering it for a number of years now.
So I can say that my own behavior has changed just a little. Like, I will not go in the woods alone.
Because of this story that you've been uncovering?
Correct.
Okay.
I will always carry a personal transponder, and I tell people, I don't care who you are. And I know Les Stroud, Survivor Man, personally, and I don't think he would go into the woods without a personal transponder. So I can say that it's a foolish thing not to do that. If you can't afford one, almost every sporting goods outdoor store will rent one to you for $5 to $10 a day.
That's smart.
So carry that. And always tell a close friend where you're going to go in, when you're going to come out, and if you're not out by a certain day, you tell them. A lot of the times, the hunters that disappeared, they're always alone. But more hunters on bow hunting side of the fence than the firearm side of the fence disappear. Meaning, for some reason, bow hunting seems to be a more dangerous thing to do. Now, these aren't predator attacks, meaning bear, mountain lion, etc.
Right.
And at the times where their clothing is found, there's no evidence of that. You know, there would be evidence.
A bear doesn't conveniently unbutton you.
No. Or roll up your belt buckle or fold your pants.
And put your shoes by your pants, yeah.
Exactly.
That doesn't happen.
In Colorado, northern Colorado, a boy named Jared Atadero disappeared. His dad told a group of singles people that they could take his son to the fish hatchery a mile away. And unbeknownst to the dad, Alan, this group of young adults decided that they were going to go walk a trail and never told the dad, and took Jocelyn and Jared on this walk up this trail. They were single people. They didn't know that you're supposed to watch kids real close.
Yeah.
Jared ran ahead of the group, walked up and saw a couple fishermen. And Jared asked the fishermen, "Are there any bear around here?" And the fisherman got upset and said, "No bear around here." And he was hitting the water with a stick, and they told him, "Hey, don't do that."
Not that. Chasing the fish away.
Right.
Yeah.
They let this kid go. Jared walked on. Was never seen alive
not
again.
Smart.
Now, 4 years later, and 600 feet up the trail, I've been on this trail 20 times. And George, I can tell you, I've never made a tougher climb in my life. It was probably 70 degrees, almost straight up for 600 feet. Exhausting. And at the top, and in this boulder-ridden area, they found his skull cap, and they found one tooth sitting on top of a log.
One tooth.
And then they found his shoes, sweatshirt, and his pants. Now, imagine this scenario.
4 years later.
4 years later, 4 winters in Colorado.
Yeah.
They turn all the evidence over to Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and I have held the shoes. George, they look brand new. Like they were never sitting outside.
Never weathered.
And then the pants were turned inside out. And the sweatshirt he was wearing still had vibrant colors. Now, I've interviewed Alan, his dad.
And they didn't look like they were out in the weather for 4 years.
No, not in the least.
It's as if something brought it back, maybe within days.
That's to me what it looks like. But
you can't keep clothes out there in Colorado for 4 years without it looking like somebody was in a mud wrestling contest.
Well, then you think about the wind and the rain and the snow. You think it would have been blown off.
Yeah.
Right? So in speaking to Alan, interviewing him, he said, one thing my son never did is he never tied his shoes.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a lot of people, and I don't understand it. If a mountain lion had grabbed him or a bear had grabbed him and drug him up that hill, there's no way those shoes would have stayed on his feet. The clothing was presented to 4 different mountain lion experts, and each of them said there's no way a mountain lion killed that boy. There would have been blood all over the clothing. His garments would have been torn to shreds. That wasn't the scenario.
No closure.
No closure, no help,
Yeah.
no assistance, no explanation, and people would just want to wash their hands of it and walk away. And that is a recurring scenario. I don't care what country you're in, that is what's happening.
Do these parents speculate on what they think might have happened?
So in the case of Jared Adadero, Alan, his dad is a teacher in Colorado. And I've interviewed him many times. And he has a very open mind. He has a difficult time believing that that clothing was out there for 4 years. He got a phone call right in the middle of this big search effort, maybe 2 weeks into it, by somebody saying that they were from the sheriff's office and they were withholding information from you. And he said, I hope you find the truth someday. And they hung up.
Huh. That's weird.
Very weird. And Alan's told me before it's bothered him as ever, 16, 17 years later. And he and I have some really good discussions. He read my book. He contacted me and he said, Dave, you're one of the few guys that was willing to tell the truth and tell the whole story. And he said, a lot of people just want to think it's something natural. The local press will just say, oh, it's a mountain lion attack.
Mountain lion. The elements got him.
Exactly. And he said, few want to get in and know the facts and hear from experts. Now in our documentary, we're going to present those experts and let the facts be known. Let people decide on their own what's going on.
Jeez. Let's talk about some of the cases of these disappearing people. David, how about Larry Dwayne Krebs?
He was at Lake Texoma in southern Oklahoma, and they were out middle of the afternoon one day collecting firewood. His dad said 8 paces behind him. He could hear him. 8. And
this desk is 4 feet long, so you just double it. That's nothing.
Not far. And you wouldn't call that negligent either. I mean, we've all done that.
Of course.
And
you turn around,
Yeah. Well, his dad said he turned around at one point and his son wasn't there.
Gone.
And search and rescue came in and they searched and they said that they followed a series of prints behind his dad's that walked into a puddle of water, and that was it. And the puddle of water was a couple inches deep.
Yeah,
it wasn't big.
It wasn't like a hole.
No. And massive search. Found nothing. And to this day, Larry's never been found. So imagine law enforcement.
How do you explain this?
Imagine law enforcement or search and rescue, never worked a case like that before, sees that. Obviously, at the beginning, your focus is going to be on the dad. And after you exclude him...
You realize the dad's in tremendous mourning. He's in shock.
Oh, yeah. And then imagine you're the dad and law enforcement is looking at you.
But you got to understand that.
Hopefully you do.
I would. I mean, I would, as upset as I would be for them even to question it, you have to understand that you're the first suspect. You're the last one to see the kid.
Right. It's a hard line for law enforcement to walk, and it's even a harder line for the parents. But having that belief system, what you just explained, would be perfect for getting law enforcement past that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, Larry's never been found.
Logic tells you that the kid was picked up. Picked up.
And again, if you would have found tracks on the ground, there would have been a scent trail. And even under that scenario, he couldn't have gone in the ground because the water was still there.
When you got into this, there must have been 1 or 2 case studies that first cropped up that got you to say, hey, there's something weird here. I'm going to study this. How'd that happen for you?
Well, originally, I got a notification from a national park ranger that he had worked at a series of national parks, and they had an unusual amount of disappearances, and the people had disappeared in unusual places that really didn't make a lot of sense to this person. And over the years, they tried to do a little research and figure out what happened, and they got stymied. And the more they looked into it, into their internal system, he got concerned that there wasn't enough being done. And eventually ended up contacting me when I was at a park doing some peripheral research. And we started to look into disappearances in the U.S. National Park system. Probably the first case that brought my interest was a case of Stacy Eros that disappeared in Yosemite.
Yeah.
a 14-year-old girl that was on a pack train ride into Sunrise Lakes, into the High Sierra area of Yosemite. Her and her dad stopped at a series of cabins. She got off her horse, freshened up, and her and a 70-year-old man named Stuart went and took a short walk off to this bluff, and she brought her camera, and they were going to just take pictures. The trail hands saw them walk over there, and she walked away from Stuart and told Stuart she was going to walk down to a lake to take some pictures. And the trail hand and Stuart saw her walk down there, and that was the last time she was ever seen.
Jeez.
Subsequent search found the lens cap to her camera right inside the tree line of that area. But the reality is they never found a trace of her after that. I filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests against the Park Service to get documents. And I have received documents before from the Park Service on other missing persons cases. I got a call from their attorney asking me why I wanted the case. And then they asked me what I was going to do with it. And finally, a special agent from the Park Service, a guy named Yu, told me I would never get that case. He didn't explain why, but he said, you're never going to get it.
Why do you think it was so secretive?
Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense because the Park Service is a big bureaucracy, and I'm sure that they have policies and procedures. And depending on which park you call on or you make the request through, you'll get reports on missing people. And a missing persons case isn't a criminal case, it's a missing person.
It's a missing person.
And most agencies want publicity about missing people.
That's right.
It appears that the Park Service doesn't want publicity about their missing people.
Scare people from going to the parks, right?
I think it might. And in this one instance, the park failed to comply and said that I would never get that case. And to this date, I don't have that case.
That's bizarre. Strictly bizarre. And there's no way you can squeeze it out of somebody.
You know, I've talked to family members of Stacy's. Her mom and her dad have died. They are equally concerned. They've read my books. They've read the stories. And they said that their dad had compiled a massive amount of documents. And he was concerned. And an uncle of theirs called me and said the same thing and said it just didn't make sense. There were a lot of rumors that, hey, she may have walked out of the park. All of this was not true. She completely disappeared.
Was the 70-year-old, the old guy, was he a suspect for a while?
No, because the trail hand just happened to see her walk away from him at the time from this rock outcropping they were sitting on.
Yeah.
So I think he was cleared from the beginning. And they had found her tracks going into this lake area inside this tree area where they found the lens cap. So I think he was absolved. And when I talked to Agent Yu on the phone, I asked him, were there any suspects? Is this continuing to be investigated? He told me that no one's touched the case for years, there are no suspects, and there's no way that it's going to get turned into a criminal case as far as he knew.
Are these cases, David, all around the country or primarily in North America?
Originally, we focused on just the United States. And slowly, as the word got out what we were doing, we started to get contacted from people from around the world. And initially, it came out of Canada that there were these additional cases. And then the Canadian National Park System seems to fall into the same category as the U.S. National Park System as far as the number of disappearances. To date in North America, we've established 52 clusters of missing people in national parks and national forests throughout North America.
Wow.
The biggest cluster in the world of missing people, Yosemite National Park.
Are these disappearances also happening in cities where you don't have parks?
So to this point, we established a profile that is based upon hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of disappearances and thousands of reports that we've read about missing people. So this profiling, it's a specific point we're looking for. Namely, canines that are brought in can't find a scent. They disappear and there's nothing heard. There's nothing seen. There's no abduction scenario.
Footprints, nothing.
Nothing. The people a lot of times are walking with friends or parents and they're either first in line or they're last in line when they disappear. And those people don't hear or see anything either.
You turn around and they're gone.
Exactly.
What percent, David, would you think could be just a natural cause? Somebody wandered off, got lost, fell, hit their head, Something like that. Small percent?
Honestly, I think we vetted that completely.
Yeah.
There is no need for me to put fluff in the books because there's just too many stories
Right.
out there. I mean, before we did this interview, I was talking to you about a series of stories that have happened just in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And in my books, I've written in the last 2 years that there seems to be some type of acceleration in the type of these cases that match the profile we established.
This is scary stuff. As you were doing your research, did anything shock you?
One of the things in the last 2 years that we found that to me is very shocking is the number of high intellectual types that have disappeared in just the last 2 years. Unexplained, never found. One off the top of my head, Alyosf Krost, K-R-O-S-T. He disappeared in the mountains above Los Angeles. He was at Lake Arrowhead attending a conference of physicists.
All right.
And they had an outing one afternoon where they went to take a hike. And during that hike, Alyosf didn't feel real good. And he and another of the escorts both didn't feel good. So they sat down and the rest of the group took off. And again, it's that last in line, first in line scenario. So the group leaves. And if anyone's ever been to Lake Arrowhead, this isn't extremely rural. There's a lot out there. But there's a trail, a lot of boulders. The group eventually made it back to the conference center. He never made it back. And there was a huge search, never been found. And there's been a series of physicists around North America and the world that have disappeared in rural areas under very, very unusual circumstances.
How bizarre.
Also, physicians are another one that have either disappeared and have been later found under highly unusual circumstances dead, or they were never found.
Of those who are not found, is it possible that they're being used for their expertise somewhere? I mean, if you're going to grab a bunch of physicists, to me, logic would tell you, this group, whoever's taking them, needs a physicist.
So I've had, again, hundreds of emails about this. And there's a lot of theories that have been thrown at me. And one of them is someone's trying to eliminate the intellect of the world.
How would they know?
There's the million-dollar question. Now, Krost was not just a physicist. He taught at one of the top universities in Germany. So he was a real intellect. And there's been several of those kind. There was a guy that was a physicist for a Canadian research firm way up in the middle of nowhere. He disappeared in the middle of the night. And there are these stories that seem to all center around intellect, which are discomforting.
How far back were you able to trace the disappearances? To what time period?
1752.
Wow, so it goes back that far, at least.
At least.
Native American legend?
There's, originally we started in the United States, went to Canada.
Yeah.
And again, the more notoriety your show is given these stories and other media outlets, people from around the world have said, hey, we heard that profile and we want to send you the story. And so now we have 8 countries involved. And I'm guessing, George, there's many more. But 8 countries, 1,600 people, and I always talk to Native Americans. I'm one of these people. I spent 50% of my life a few years ago on the Hoopa Reservation in Northern California.
Yeah.
And I always listen to
learned.
them. I learned to pay attention to what they say.
This is, David, and I've got to tell you, in my career as a broadcaster, the most riveting, scary story I have ever heard. Scary because we can't control it. Riveting because we don't know what it is.
I've heard that many times, but I appreciate hearing it from you. And the almost those exact words were told to me by someone and said, this is why the government's doing everything they can to block you from getting the information.
What does David Paulides do next in this area?
I think one of the things is I have to keep an open mind, and the people I work with have to keep that open mind. And you brought up the point about, well, how do we know it's not happening in urban areas? And we're looking at that really hard right now. And I think it's a good point, because I think if we restrict ourselves to that rural environment, that we may be missing a big piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely, because if you find out it's happening in urban areas too, then there are other scenarios involved.
Exactly.
You can rule out animals, I would think. In a lot of these cases, you find strange cases where the clothes, it's just laid out, but it's not attacked, it's not ripped, it's not torn. It's almost as if somebody would take it off, lie it down, and they're still gone, right?
It's just not the clothes. It's also shoes. I have several cases where searchers found the people's clothes neatly folded. One time they were neatly folded in the middle of a river. Now, one of the constants is that many of these people are found either in, next to, or adjoining a dry creek bed, boulder field, lake, reservoir. One of the specific scenarios that we get asked is that, well, maybe it's an animal attack. So in the search and rescue reports, they bring in trackers, they bring professional people in. In each one of those cases, it's completely absolved that there isn't an animal attack.
There's going to be noise. You're going to hear, animals don't attack and they're not quiet.
No, sir. This has never been seen, not in the cases that we'll work. It's true, people are attacked by animals. I don't doubt that, and I know for a fact that that's true. In these cases, we won't work a case where there's an animal attack.
I know, chatting with you on our radio show, Coast to Coast AM, David, that you don't like to speculate on a specific reason or cause, but we're going to throw out some possibilities and let our viewers, of course, make up their own minds about something like this. But let me ask you, would you consider these disappearances to be natural or highly unusual? Sounds like I'm trying to trap you here.
I'll do one better. Extremely unusual.
Extremely unusual.
They don't fit the normal disappearance scenario. When you talk to, in 2012, I made a presentation in front of the National Association of Search and Rescue Professionals, and nobody left the room for the entire time I talked. They were stunned at some of the things I
get
said.
emails when you're on Coast to Coast, and I have had thousands of guests. When you're on the program, my emails start going up, 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 and then afterward, the next day, it's clogged with people, petrified, confused, desperate for more information. It's one of the strangest stories I've ever heard, Dave.
Well, and I think when you get into the minutia of the data, it gets even stranger, because the same scenario of missing person to missing person plays out over and over and over again.
Okay. Now, of the people that are found alive, the small number, are they in shock? Do they talk about, I wandered away and I got lost? What do they say?
So part of that profiling is understanding the personality of the person or the background of the person who disappeared. And many, many times, the people that disappear have some type of disability, whether it's autism, dementia, inability to speak.
An astronomical percentage.
Yes.
It's very strange.
It is very strange. And when those people are found, and they are found at a higher percentage than the people that can speak, those people obviously can't tell a story. There have been instances where people have disappeared and they are found. Most recently, a couple years ago, a woman disappeared, I believe it was in Arkansas, and she was eventually found, and she said, for 3 days, I knew that there were people behind bushes that were watching me the entire time. And they didn't help me, and I walked up to them sometimes and tried to talk to them, but they wouldn't talk to me. And she said she was very scared. And they interviewed a doctor about it, and he said, no, she wasn't making this up. She believes that happened.
What kind of people were they?
It's a great question. I don't know.
I know deep down inside, you've got some speculation here. Is it difficult for you not to just say, I think it's this?
George, I can't describe that I'm an expert in all of these different fields that people have come at me with. And, there's probably been 8 different hypotheses, an almost thesis length form that people have written to me about, explaining why they believe that
It was this thing, yeah.
Exactly. And they come at it with emotion and interest, and I can't say no to any of them. And if you want me to go through the list, glad to.
Yeah, let's do that. What we're talking about here, folks, again, missing people primarily in forests and parks, state or federal, that are simply gone. And your guess, how many people are we talking about since this phenomenon has come under your wrap?
So we've identified 1,600 cases.
1,600 people.
But you got to remember that the national parks and the U.S. National Forest Service isn't helping us or assisting us because they won't tell us how many people are missing.
So we're saying 1,600 reported cases.
That we know of.
That we know of.
Right.
Okay, let's go through the scenarios of the possibilities, what could be happening, from the logical to the illogical.
So start at the most mundane when our government's doing tests on them.
Okay.
I've heard that 50 times in the last 5 years. That scenario to me doesn't make a lot of sense because canines would be able to track that.
Right.
And
people would hear it. Somebody would see it.
Eventually, yeah, for sure. Something I really know nothing about is people say that there's reptilians out there, and the reptilians are in the woods taking these people and feeding off them.
Extraterrestrials. Yeah.
Or ultra-terrestrials, and they're here, living in, like some people have stated that they live underground. I don't know. Obviously, there's the alien connection that I've heard 10,000 times.
Do people see craft around some of these scenes?
That's never been reported.
Okay.
But one thing that people do say is that in conjunction with these disappearances, immediately after or right after, part of that profile is that there's bad weather associated with this, meaning in many of these cases, sometimes it rains inches and inches or snows feet and feet in days right afterwards.
Kind of wipes out the scene, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
And so aliens, alien abduction, that's a really common one. Another one that I've heard a lot from Europe and Iceland is fairies.
Fairies.
Fairies and little people.
Uh-huh.
And I've actually written about that in some of my books because the folklore and mythology that surrounds it talks about them abducting people.
Yes, that's right.
So
ancient folklore.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then another one is that there's gods. And the gods at times take people for their own will. Mm-hmm. And part of that taking of them is that if they don't fit the eventual needs of those gods, they're replaced back on earth. And those are the ones we find deceased. I've heard that probably 200 times. The other one that, you know, a lot of people may think is true is that there's a group of serial killers out there in the woods.
Correct.
To me, that is the least likely of every scenario. Not that I'm categorizing anything, but the reason being is that in these searches, they bring in professional trackers. Part of that professional tracking ability is tracking somebody through the woods. And some of the people they use are Navajo trackers, military trackers, professional private trackers in conjunction with canines.
And nothing.
Nothing. They don't find tracks leaving the scene. They don't find a scent. So my idea, or the idea that people promote that it's a serial killer in the woods, there's a lot of things that go with that. And mainly, if there was a serial killer in the woods, then they'd have to carry that body for a mile.
You mentioned the alien possibilities, yet minimal reports of craft being seen. What if these higher intelligent beings have the capability of teleporting an individual almost with an instant from above, so high up, you don't see the craft, you don't see the lights, yet they beam in on David Paulides, George Noory. They see them walking there in the forest and just, they're up, they're gone. Maybe? And they're taking people of certain educational standards.
Well, George, if they could do that, this show would go to #1, I'm telling you.
Yeah, we'd be gone. We'd be gone. We'll come back from a break and you'll be gone, right?
Again,
but it's frightening.
If that scenario could play out, that's very frightening because Again, as I've been told many times, that's the scenario in many people's minds that's being worked out.
When they track, do they get to a certain point and it just ends?
Sometimes it ends immediately, and sometimes they do get to that point and the scent just stops. A lot of times, some of the best canine trackers in the world have said that they'll bring the dog to the scene, and the dog will walk in a circle, lay down, and doesn't want to track.
He's scared.
Well, the description from some of the searchers is that they can't tell if the dog is uninterested or there is no search.
Yeah.
So,
What about Bigfoot?
that's another scenario that's been brought up hundreds and hundreds of times, and I would say that the issue with that one is the same with the others in that there's no tracks.
Right.
And if you were going to carry somebody, drag somebody, I think you would hear something on the front end
You would think.
of something unusual.
What about a portal, another dimension, some kind of, God knows what is going on in this planet, this universe, and that these people just accidentally walk right through it and they're gone and they can't get back?
Well, in all of the scenarios, in what's been explained to me by other experts that have been on your show, to me, that one, if it exists, would be the one that fit every scenario that we've explained in the book. Not that I'm saying that is it. I'm just saying that the scenario the experts lay out seems to be the one that fits the most criteria. As an example, there was a hunter in Colorado that contacted me a couple years ago. And he was hunting for elk at about 10 or 11,000 feet up in northern Colorado. And he said he was walking on a plain where the grass was maybe 4 feet high, 3 or 4 feet. And he heard something coming towards him and he couldn't really identify it. And he kept walking. He got on a trail and he kept hearing a loud hum. And he started to slow down on the trail. And he said in front of him it became real blurry.
Whoa.
So he slowed down even more.
Like an opening.
Something, he says it was almost like you were looking through glasses that weren't yours, and it was just strange looking. And he said he almost walked up to it and it looked like a plate of glass, and he stuck his foot through and part of his foot disappeared. And he said, I brought my foot back and I turned around and I ran. That's the first time I've heard that.
Yeah.
But I suppose what would happen to you if you had your head down, you weren't paying attention? I don't know.
That's a good point.